just briefly, what's irrationality? And then conversely, what's rationality?
Well, perfect example of extreme irrationality is what we've just been talking about, what Orwell called doublethink. The ability to have two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time and to believe both of them. That's the peak of irrationality. And that virtually defines the elite intellectual community.
Successful intellectual, right?
Yeah, okay, so that's irrationality. Now let's take concrete examples of fundamentalist irrationality. So I'll give you a real example. Actually, it's an example I knew about 5 years ago, but I didn't publish it because it sounded so crazy it couldn't be true. It turns out to be true. It's now verified. In January 2003, immediately before the invasion of Iraq, George Bush was trying to round up international support for the invasion. And he met the French President Chirac. And in this meeting with Chirac, he started ranting about a passage from Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel. It's a very obscure passage nobody understands. It's a passage about Gog and Magog. Nobody knows if they're people or places or whatever they are. But Gog and Magog are supposed to come from the north and attack Israel. And then we get off into ultra-fanatic Christian evangelical madness. There's a whole big story about how Gog and Magog come down, attack Israel. There's a battle in Armageddon. Everybody gets slaughtered. And the souls who are saved rise to heaven. Okay, some kind of story like that. Reagan apparently believed it. When his handlers didn't control him enough, and he was kind of off by himself, he'd start raving about this stuff. And for him, Gog and Magog were Russia. For Bush, Gog and Magog were Iraq. So he told this to Chirac, and Chirac had no clue what he was talking about. So he approached the French Foreign Office, the Élysée, and said, do you know what this madman is raving about? And they didn't know either. So they approached a Belgian, pretty well-known Belgian theologian, who wrote a sort of a disquisition on this passage and the way it's interpreted and what it might mean and so on. Okay, how do I know? Well, I know because that Belgian theologian and his friend sent me a copy of it with the background of the story. I never published it because this just sounded too off the wall. Finally, I was talking to an Australian academic researcher, and I mentioned it to him. He decided to look into it. It turns out to be correct. In fact, the story appears in the biographies of Chirac and in other evidence. So yeah, that actually happened. So here's the world in the hands of a raving lunatic who, is talking about Gog and Magog and Armageddon and the souls rising to heaven. And, the world survived. Well, okay, that's not a small thing in the United States. I don't know the percentages, but it's maybe 25, 30% of the population. Yeah, that's pretty serious irrationality.
Okay. Science, then. What's science? I mean, why is something scientific? What marks something as being sensible science or nonsensical, non-science masquerading, etc.? On the one hand, and since you're going to answer fully, how do you feel about left criticisms of science? Leftists who criticize science as being, whatever they say, it's imperial or it's sexist or it's rooted in Western whatever, and so on.
Well, like anything that we understand about at all with regard to things as complicated as human affairs, the answers are pretty trivial. If they're not trivial, we don't understand it. There is a category of intellectuals who are undoubtedly perfectly sincere, who, if you look at it from the outside, what they're actually doing is using polysyllabic words and complicated constructions, which apparently they seem to understand because they talk to each other. Most of the time I can't understand what the heck they're talking about. Even people who are supposed to be in my field. It's all very inflated and, a lot of prestige and so on. that has a terrible effect in the third world. In the first world, the rich countries, it doesn't really matter that much. So if a lot of nonsense goes on in the Paris cafes or the Yale comparative literature department, well, okay. On the other hand, in the third world, popular movements really need serious intellectuals to participate. And if they're all ranting postmodern absurdities, well, they're gone. I mean, I've seen real examples, could give them to you. But so there is that category. And it's considered very left-wing and very advanced and so on and so forth. Well, some of what appears in it actually makes sense. But when you reproduce it in monosyllables, it turns out to be truisms. So yes, it is perfectly true that if you look at scientists in the West, they're mostly men. And it's perfectly true that women have had a hard time breaking into the scientific fields. And it's perfectly true that there are institutional factors determining how science proceeds that reflect power structures. I mean, all of this can be described literally in monosyllables, and it turns out to be truisms when you... Okay. On the other hand, you don't get to be a respected intellectual by presenting truisms in monosyllables. Now, a lot of the left criticism, so when the left, so-called left criticism, I don't consider it left, when the left criticism, so-called, happens to be accurate, well, okay, that's fine. So if you point out a lot of things, just like what I mentioned, there are a lot of them, no, that's fine. You know, point it out, you know, everybody can understand it, you take a look, you see it's true, and so on. On the other hand, a lot of the so-called left criticism seems to be pure nonsense. In fact, that's been demonstrated conclusively. So there's a very important book by Jean Bricon and Alan Sokal, I forget what it's called, Dangerous Illusions or something, where they simply go through they happen to concentrate on Paris, which is the center of the rot, but it's all over. And they go through the most respected French intellectuals and run through what they say about science. And, you know, it is so embarrassing that you kind of cringe when you read it. Actually, sometimes, one of my most striking ones is one of the very few who actually is a scientist and knows something about science. Latour has a background in science and philosophy of science. They go through an article of his, and I think I'm remembering correctly, in which somebody in France had, or somewhere, had discovered that one of the pharaohs had died of tuberculosis. And they did it by, you know, analysis of whatever, DNA or something. Latour wrote an article ridiculing this, because he said it's totally absurd.
Because nobody had talked about
it. Yeah, tuberculosis was only discovered in the 19th century, and everything's a social construction, and
therefore it wasn't constructed yet.
So it didn't happen. I mean, you know, it's kind of at the level of Bush and Chirac. Yeah. But it's taken very seriously, and this is considered very leftist. You know.
But one point to look at, I think, is that the description of intellectuals, the description of journalists, and now the description of this sector of part of what calls itself the left, you have something similar going on, even though the price is much lower. You have those guys sitting in the air-conditioned rooms bombing the hell out of the world for their careers, for their status, because of their reflexive lessons that they've learned. And then over here you have people who are in literary criticism or whatever field they might be in, who are also completely divorced from reality or obscuring it or dolling it up for similar reasons. Of course, the price is much less. I mean, it's high, but it's...
In the third world, it's high.
But it's
in
still...
the rich countries, it's just a pain in the neck.
Still not like bombing the world.
Yeah, I think...
But it's the same phenomenon.
They're hard to understand. I mean, they're nice people. A lot of them are friends. And if you look at what's happening, I think it's pretty easy to figure out what's going on. I mean, suppose you're a literary scholar at some elite university, or, you know, anthropologist or whatever. I mean, if you do your work seriously, that's fine, you know, but it's not very, I mean, you don't get any big prizes for it. On the other hand, you take a look over in the rest of the university, and you got these guys in the physics department and the math department, and they have all kind of complicated theories, which of course we can't understand, but they seem to understand them. And they have, principles, and they deduce complicated things from the principles, and they do experiments, and, they find either they work or they don't work. And that's really, impressive stuff. So I want to be like that too. So I want to have a theory. In literary, in the humanities, literary criticism, anthropology, and so on, there's a field called theory. We're just like the physicists. They talk incomprehensibly, we can talk incomprehensibly. They have big words, we'll have big words. They draw, far-reaching conclusions, we'll draw far-reaching conclusions. We're just as prestigious as they are. Now, if they say, well, look, we're doing real science and you guys aren't, that's white, male, sexist, bourgeois, whatever the answer is. How are we any different from them? Okay, that's appealing. And there are other things that went on. Remember that a lot of this stuff comes from Paris. And interesting things were happening in Paris in the 1970s. The French intellectuals were the last group of intellectuals in the world who were dedicated, overwhelmingly, not 100%, but it was very standard and respected to be a dedicated Stalinist and Maoist. Okay, by the mid-70s, that was getting to be a pretty hard position to uphold. So what you had, if you take a look at what happened, is there was a sudden shift. People who had been flaming Maoists and Stalinists suddenly became the first people in the world to have discovered the Gulag, and went on a tear about how everyone else supports, Stalinist and Maoist atrocities, and we're France, of course, so we have to be in front of everyone. So therefore, we've exposed it, and now it was called the New Philosophy, or New Philosophers or something. And it went over all kinds. I remember meeting, I won't mention names because it's embarrassing, one of the leading French cultural theorists who happened to visit me around 1974, and she was a flaming Maoist. A couple of years later, she was one of the first people to have understood, to have, discovered Stalinist and Maoist atrocities. Well, okay, when you went through that transition, you got to do something else. How are you going to be, on the front pages? Okay. Along comes the invention of post-structuralism.
All right, what about religion? What do you think religion is?
Well, for one thing, it's virtually, depending what you mean by religion. I mean, if you mean the Abrahamic religions,
We're on weak ground here because, of course, I'm religiously illiterate. But
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Well, no, I mean, I guess, yeah, and the other such religions of that type. What are those?
Well, Buddhism is different. Yeah. Spiritual beliefs among Native Americans was different. No, there's all kind of religions.
The distinction that we're talking about there.
We're talking about the Abrahamic religion.
No, Catholicism,
Protestantism. That's the
Hindu, I guess.
No, Hindus are different. It's quite different. Buddhism is quite different. If you really look at these systems of belief, they differ a lot. In fact,
no. But what I'm asking is, what is religion per se? Not what are the beliefs of a particular religion?
Belief that there's something in the world which is beyond my grasp, which is determining the way things happen, and it's going to, it'll be a consolation for me. Maybe, if my child is dying, I'll see him again in heaven somewhere. These kinds of beliefs, and that there's a sort of a spiritual force somewhere beyond my grasp. And that explains why things are happening. Well, that's probably ubiquitous. That's perfectly understandable.
Yeah.
Weird things are happening. Like the sun is going around the earth. You can see it. It doesn't have to be happening, but you see it. Well, something must be making it happen. Okay, so it's Apollo on his chariot pulling the sun. And the same with everything else goes on. You don't understand anything that's happening in the world, in personal life, and why is my child, sweet little wonderful kid, dying? He didn't do anything. So there's got to be some explanation somewhere.
So it's a set of stories to make sense of reality, except not science.
I mean, Apollo pulling the sun with a chariot is, well, it's early science.
Yeah, before you
It's a kind of a scientific theory, it's going to get worked out, not trivial. Like, for example, the classical Greeks did discover a lot of things.
But if you say it now, when there's lots of evidence other than that, then it's no longer science.
That just means that our understanding has deepened.
Right.
But the transition from magic to science is a pretty smooth transition, and it just even the word science in English didn't even appear until the mid-19th century. There was a word, but it meant something else, just meant knowledge. In the mid-19th century, there was a divorce between science and philosophy. Before, it was just philosophy. In fact, if you go to Oxford, let's say, you can study natural philosophy and moral philosophy. Natural philosophy is what we here call the natural sciences. Moral philosophy is what we call the humanities. But through German, it's the same thing. So the whole concept of science, in our sense, is a pretty recent one. And it began, and there was an intellectual revolution. It sort of begins with Galileo and goes on, and it led to enormous insights. And after a while, science just kind of took off and became a special domain. In the early 19th century, it was, take, say, Kant. He couldn't have told you whether he was a philosopher or a scientist. He taught astronomy. He taught moral philosophy. And, an intelligent, educated gentleman did all those things. Well, by the mid-19th century, it's becoming very hard to do all those things. The sciences were reaching a point where you really understand things. And you couldn't be a gentleman who knows everything. Things got professionalized, and we get, what we call science, separate domain. But recall how recent this is. Prior to that, people were trying to figure things out. And we might now call what they're trying to figure out magic, but these are pretty smart people. Take, say, Isaac Newton. He's not a fool exactly. He's now people laugh about the fact that he spent most of his life working on chemistry and church fathers. That was alchemy and church fathers. That was perfectly reasonable. In terms of what are called corpuscularian theories that everybody accepted. The world is made up of little building blocks like bricks. And
shift a few.
Yeah, shift a few and you get gold from lead. That makes perfect sense. As for the church fathers, that made perfect sense too. He was coming right after the humanist period, when there had been a sudden discovery of the wealth and richness of classical civilizations, which hadn't been known. So the belief expanded that these guys really understood something. And they were kind of keeping it secret for us, so they were doing it in an esoteric way. And if we can decode what they were doing, we'll get all kind of wonderful discoveries. So it wasn't an irrational pursuit. And
that was a long time ago.
Not that long ago. This is the 17th century. Right. And this is Isaac Newton.
It wasn't in my lifetime. It was in your lifetime, right? So when you come closer to the present, you have some things about religion that have been painful and have caused suffering and great harm, and other things about religion that have been pretty exemplary and that have contributed to justice.
Surely, let's take liberation theology. That was a revival of early Christianity, and it was so threatening to the United States that the U.S. launched a war against it.
I want to switch to a political variant of some of the things we've been talking about, which is the term called sectarianism.
Sometimes it's genuine disagreements,
right,
which should be worked out with solidarity, mutual sympathy and support and so on. We've all been in activist groups, and it goes on and on. We have long meetings because there are real issues to discuss. So that's
one phenomenon.
That's the right kind of, it's the right kind of, if you like, sectarianism. A lot of it's ego tripping. I want to be Lenin, so you follow me, and there's a lot of that. I've got my doctrines and ideology, and if you don't accept them, you're an enemy of the working people or whatever it happens to be. And it's extremely common among groups that don't have much mass support, that are kind of isolated, that don't either don't have a lot to do or like to believe that they don't have a lot to do. And sectarianism is one of the ways of avoiding engagement. We don't have to give examples. I mean, it's rampant. A lot of it's pretty ugly.
But it's not only the behavior. There's something about, it seems to me, holding a viewpoint in a sectarian fashion, sort of like holding a viewpoint in a fundamentalist fashion, has this element of it's true because it's doctrine, it's true because it's in a book, it's true because I believe it or because somebody else who I admire believes it. And it's unchallengeable. It's just the way it is.
Well, that kind of sectarianism, of course, can destroy groups.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, any decent government infiltrator, and there are plenty of them, would want to stimulate that kind of sectarianism. We've all seen it happen.
Of course.
You remember, say in the 60s, one of the things that every group had to learn, often the hard way, is that even among your small circle, there's a provocateur. And after a while, it got to be sort of possible to pick them out. They were the ones who were going to show up at the trials and that sort of thing. But pretty soon people got to know that if there's someone in the group who's dressed like a Hollywood version of a hippie and who's saying, stop this nonsense, let's go out and kill the cops and so on and so forth, chances are he's a provocateur. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a government provocateur. A lot of these small groups are parasitic on popular movements, and they try to recruit. So they join, they work, they sit around at the meetings longer than anyone else. They, try to get in a position of some kind of control, and then recruit it to their own particular sect. That goes on all the time, and it's very disruptive to popular movements.
But I'm talking about, of course, but I'm talking about good people who have historically, have in their lives been perfectly sensible people who, for whatever reasons, become sectarian, meaning they adopt a set of views and are no longer open to the possibility that those views could be wrong, that any evidence could be contrary to those views. They no longer can see the world except in terms of those views. That's sort of what I mean by sectarianism, where it's not because they're trying to, they're not police, and they're not, it's just...
But that's part of life,
Yeah.
I mean, you have it in most advanced scientists. Like, take, say, Einstein.
I use that example often.
Okay,
right?
He just wouldn't believe that, as he put it, God could throw dice with a cosmos.
Do you worry about behaving in that fashion? Getting caught in that kind of... yeah, yourself.
Sure, anybody sensible.
Okay, so what's the personal
That doesn't mean you
antidote?
shouldn't do it, because sometimes you really do believe you're right, and you should pursue it.
So, but what's the personal antidote to the rampant phenomenon?
For an individual,
Yeah.
it's just to try to be as open-minded and sympathetic to others as you can. It's not easy. And in controversial, complicated situations, or even in the hard sciences. I mean, I find it all the time, and just in professional work. Okay, you sort of try to deal with it somehow.
And the structural antidote? Imagine you're...
I don't think there is. In general, there isn't one, because it's a good thing. I mean, I don't criticize Einstein for having not been willing to believe quantum theoretic approaches, and in fact, as you know way better than I do, a lot of good experimental proposals came out of that. What's it called? The quantum, the things too far apart to communicate that are, the name for that, I forget what it is. That came out of an experimental proposal that Einstein and a couple others made. But so there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, that's the way human behavior ought to be. I mean, it can get to the point where it becomes a personal ego trip. It becomes an effort to take over and control. But these are just aspects of human life that you have to deal with. It can happen in a family.
Yes.
There's no general answer.
There is this creationism phenomenon, which bears on science also. What has been your reaction?
First, a lot of it comes from a religious source. I mean, people, and a lot of it's really genuine. People do not want to accept the idea that what they interpret as meaning, everything is determined. It doesn't mean, science doesn't mean that, but that's, if you have a superficial understanding of science, and in fact, even if you read what plenty of scientists and philosophers say, it's basically saying, look, you don't have any free will, you don't have any choices, everything's determined, it's all, you're just kind of acting out something in a system of controls that you have nothing to do with. Well, I don't want to believe that, in fact don't, and I can easily see why other people don't want to believe it. They want to believe that there's something good going on in the world. Maybe I can't grasp it, but there's a force somewhere that is trying to make us better, make the world better, make good things happen and bad things not happen. And it's just, and also it's just for personal reasons. To go back to the mother of the dying child, I want to see my child again someday, so I'd like to believe it. Well, one consequence of this array of beliefs is to think that the world was created. And that's very common. I mean, founding fathers, for example, who did want to separate church and state, were called deists. The idea was God, it was even said this way, God is a retired engineer. He got the whole thing started, gave it a kick in the pants, and then he left, and you guys are supposed to run it. Well, that was, kind of like sort of secular religion that was common at the time. But at the same time, the U.S. has, since its origins, has been kind of off the spectrum in extremist religious beliefs. I mean, if you do look at, there are comparative studies, and belief in the United States, belief in miracles, in the devil, the world was created 10,000 years ago, and so on, is just off the spectrum. You don't find that. To some extent, you find it in other industrial societies, like in England, you find it. But the United States is literally off the graph. And this goes back to its origins. I mean, the country was founded by religious extremists. The people who founded, the settlers of New England were following God's will. There's a streak in U.S. history which is called providentialism. Very dominant streak, goes all the way from, founding fathers, so-called, up to the current presidents and so on. God has a conception of history. We're acting it out. And some of the ways in which this was applied are pretty remarkable. So, for example, the core of, take, say, the English settlers in New England, Mayflower and all that stuff. The first charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, given by the King Charles, was, I think, 1628. And the goal of the Massachusetts colony was to bring the benefits of civilization, including the Christian religion, to the Indians who were pleading for it. We're doing them a favor. In fact, if you look at the Great Seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, around 1629, they had a seal. It's very revealing. It ought to be on the wall of every classroom in the country. What it shows, it's the founding of the country. What it shows is an Indian with spears pointed down, sign of peace, and out of the Indian's mouth is a scroll, and the scroll says, "Come over and help us." So the colonists were carrying out what is now called the responsibility to protect, fancy term for imperialism that's common. So they were carrying out the responsibility to protect. They were totally selfless. They were coming over just to answer the plea of the indigenous population to come over and help us. That's the time when the famous phrase, "city on a hill," was produced. 1630, John Winthrop gave a famous statement and said, "We're a city on the hill, we're not like any other country in the world, we're benevolent, selfless, coming over to answer the plea of the Indians to help us." That goes right until today. That's a leading theme of scholarship, that we're different, and journalism, of course, that we're just different from everyone else because we're a city on the hill. shining city on the hill, as Reagan put it. It's right to this minute. And the reason comes from our answering the plea of the natives to help them. Well, in fact, they exterminated them. And that was explained too. You take a look at leading Supreme Court justices, commentators, others, they say, well, the ways of God are mysterious. Although we came to help the Indians and we tried, everything we did was in their interest, somehow they withered away, And that's the phrase that was used. They just kind of like the leaves in autumn, they kind of blew away. And this goes right on to the present. I mean, towards the end of the century, like say early 20th century, I mean, it's pretty hard to go on with this. So you get people like Theodore Roosevelt, one of the most extreme racist, murderers in American history. That's why he's on Mount Rushmore. He explained to, he was, during the second term of his presidency, it must have been maybe 1906 or 7, I don't know when exactly, he gave a talk to a group of missionaries in which he explained to them that it was for the benefit of the native population that we exterminated them. Literally, almost his words. He said because it enabled a superior race to replace them. And that was very common. I mean, you read things like that in Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, I mean, the great heroes. This is an extremely racist country. And they invented a mythology of Anglo-Saxonism. We're all Anglo-Saxons, like you and me. We're Anglo-Saxons. Jefferson, for example, who was a big believer in this, said we've got to go back to, like, I don't know, the 8th century or something, when there were pure Anglo-Saxons, not before they were contaminated by others, and that's the ideal of humanity and justice and everything. This runs, Benjamin Franklin, for example,
so the
thought that
Germans
we
just got
shouldn't.
there first.
He
The
thought
Germans
that,
just got there first as a
well,
massive.
actually, Franklin thought that we shouldn't allow immigration of Germans and Swedes because they're not white enough. They're kind of a little off color. But we, the pure Anglo-Saxons, just carry civilization forward. I mean, it goes, it's incredible, the history of it. I won't go through it, but Hitler looks mild in comparison. And this goes right through in fact, Hitler kind of used this as a model. It goes right through American history, goes right until today. It's part of the American exceptionalism, Wilsonian idealism, very racist, and it's just all over. Okay, well, one aspect of these beliefs is just what most of the world would call religious extremism. So there were what were called great reawakenings in American history, periods of sort of mass enthusiasm, because Christ is coming or whatever it may be. And it's all over the place. It just keeps recurring. There was a big one in the 1950s. And you get, it's changed in the last 30 years in an interesting way. I mean, this has been right through American history, but it never really entered the core of the political system. I mean, there were, it influenced things. But there was a big change. I think it comes from I don't think it's ever been studied, but my impression is it comes from Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was an honest, sincere, fundamentalist Christian. Probably believed everything he was saying. Kind of like an honest, simple guy. So all this business, which most of the world considers kind of like off the wall, he believed. And I think party and American elections are essentially run by the PR industry, and party managers got an idea, I think. I can't prove it, but it seems to me what happened is this. Party managers recognized that if you pretend to be, a devout Christian, you pick up like 30% of the vote. And in fact, every presidential candidate since Carter has professed to be a devout Christian. Take, say, Bill Clinton, probably is about as religious as I am. His handlers made sure that every Monday morning there was a photograph of him in the Baptist church or whatever it is, singing hymns and so on and so forth. I mean, that's a way in which you sort of pick up a segment of the population. And I don't think there's a single exception since Carter.
You lose integrity, honesty, and everything else goes down the drain, of course, as a habitual obstacle
but
to
it's
success.
appealing to something that's pretty deep in American culture, including, it's intertwined with racism, with Anglo-Saxon fanaticism, with come over and help us. You find it's just a big strain in the culture.
You've been very skeptical of what are called conspiracy theories, popular conspiracy theories from Kennedy assassination through 9/11. So, not dealing with those specific theories, but more with the general issue. What advice would you give to people who are trying to figure out when elites are in fact conspiring, and when the view that they are doing that is really just a cultish conspiracy theory?
So, say, take the Second World War. Okay, we're not talking about the Roosevelt administration, most liberal administration ever. From 1939 to 1945, there were meetings taking place. I mean, these people have brains. There were meetings taking place of high-level State Department planners and the Council on Foreign Relations, which is kind of like the out-of-government closest organization of business people, others who are kind of have interests in foreign policy. It's not a secret organization. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about it, but it's quite open. And they were meeting regularly. They had something called the War Peace Studies Group, in which they were planning for the post-war world. Well, makes good sense. I mean,
why is that a conspiracy?
They were conspiring to figure out what to do in the post-war world.
By that argument, everybody is conspiring.
Yeah, it is. The board of General Motors is conspiring. It's a conspiracy. They're working together, top-level planners, to decide how to run the world. And what they said is extremely interesting. In fact, they laid out principles which were quite interesting, which are still carried out. They're still the guiding principles. They were implemented in the early post-war world. Their proposals are almost the same as those that the government developed in the late 40s. Okay, that's a real conspiracy theory. Now, there, in fact, is one book about it by Larry Shoup and William Minter. It's called Imperial Brain Trust. Okay, the phrase is okay. They should have given it a different title because it gives the mainstream an easy way to just disregard it. It's very accurate. It just quotes the documents. It's virtually unmentionable, and the people on the left who are looking for conspiracy theories never mention it. It's a conspiracy, an open conspiracy, which had lots of consequences. It still does. Or take, say, there are some technical conspiracies, like where people go to jail for conspiracy. One of them has enormous influence in, should be better known. I mean, in the 1940s, General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil of California conspired to buy up and destroy the very efficient electric railway systems in Los Angeles and many other places, and convert it all to use of fossil fuels, trucks, cars, and so on. Well, that was one part of a huge social engineering project, the government and others, corporations, which just changed the country to something which may destroy the species. We're now living with it, the wasteful use of fossil fuel, which was purposeful. They were taken to court. They were sentenced. They got a fine, I think $5,000 or something like that. But it was a real conspiracy, and one with enormous consequences. And there are many more like it.
There's a difference in kind between that and what people are referring to when they're talking about conspiracy theories. What's the difference in kind?
One difference is these are real. They're real major conspiracies which have huge consequences. But what a lot of people are looking for is some, it's kind of a little bit like the people who listen to Rush Limbaugh. They want an answer. The world is rotten. There must be something going on that we don't know about. And if we could only ferret it out, that would tell us why the world is rotten. Actually, the reason is right in front of your eyes. And there's plenty of evidence about it, but that's not exciting enough. So we want to believe, take, say, the Kennedy conspiracy theories. I mean, there's only one interesting question that I know of about the Kennedy assassination. Namely, was it a high-level conspiracy with policy consequences? If it wasn't, then unless you worship royalty, I don't see why it's different from the last killing in Roxbury. You know, yeah, you don't want somebody to be killed. But the conspiracy theorists, good friends, incidentally, who think I'm, really think I'm kind of like a major criminal for this, they're devoted to something else. They want to show that there was a high-level conspiracy which took away from us this magnificent person who was going to do all sorts of terrific things, and make it a better world. And it's because they killed him that we got into the awful mess that we're in. Well, there are ways of investigating that. You can look at Kennedy's policies. You can look at his statements. You can look at his actions. You can look at what followed when exactly his advisors, same people, including the Doves, made the decisions. And you can see that he was one of the hawkish members toward the hawkish side of his administration. He was dragged kind of reluctantly into a little support for civil rights and a few other things. He was carrying out the terror wars against Cuba right to the day of the assassination, and on and on. And furthermore, nothing changed. I mean, what changed with the same advisors, the ones who were giving, even the ones who were advising him on withdrawal, how good idea. They did change their positions because the facts changed. But there's no indication, and there isn't the slightest particle of evidence of any high-level conspiracy. So therefore you look for something else. The CIA didn't like him for this, that, and the other reason. And there's a huge industry about that. And of course, in all these things, you put piles of factoids together, If you have no conception of what a theory and an explanation is, and remember, most people outside the sciences don't, what you do is collect factoids. This happened, that happened, how do you explain that, how do you explain this? I mean, if you were to look at scientific experiments that way, you could disprove all science. I mean, that's one of the reasons why scientists do experiments. Instead of taking videotapes of what's happening out the window, you take videotapes, why did that thing move over there? I don't see any reason for it, and so obviously somebody's pushing it. Okay, these elementary facts, understanding is mostly gone outside of the sciences. It's one of the reasons why I think, any educational system, people ought to study something about the sciences, just so you learn what an argument is, and you see what an explanation is. But for most of education, that's gone. So they're trying to put something together, and you have these very elaborate schemes and systems. There's no evidence for them, but you got to believe them. Like, it's not that I disbelieve them. Like, maybe they're true, maybe they're right. Maybe it was the CIA. Maybe it was the mafia. Maybe it was this. Maybe it was that. Who cares? It has essentially no significance unless you believe that in the Camelot story, that Kennedy was just about to do the most magnificent things, and that's why he was killed. But then you have to have some evidence for that. And when you look at those stories, they're extremely interesting. Even really good people, I could list them, good historians, the kind of evidence they give is kind of shocking. The main idea is, well, Kennedy was kind of a Machiavellian. He had these plans in his mind to do all kind of wonderful things, but he had to conceal them from his advisors because they would have blocked them. So he therefore said, we can't get out of Vietnam before victory. But that was in order to delude McNamara and other people so they wouldn't know that he really was going to get out. And it goes on and on like this. I mean, it's all just worship of royalty. Which is kind of nice. You feel something magnificent was happening. And the Camelot story is a very easy one to believe in because Kennedy was no fool. He knew, he understood right away, you want to get a good press and, a good record, butter up the intellectuals. Make them think you love them. And he did. You're a little too young to remember, but in the early 60s in Cambridge, every morning on the Eastern Shuttle, Harvard and MIT professors were flying down to Washington to have lunch with Jackie and to say hello to Jack and talk to Dean and all that kind of stuff. and coming back in the evening just glowing with joy at how they were rubbing shoulders with royalty. And they were treating them nicely, probably making fun of them when they left, but and they got a very good, they got a very good image. That's where the Camelot story comes from. But if you try to look at the facts, it just, just shrivels away. So what you have to do is say, well, the facts really didn't matter. He had these Machiavellian schemes and so on. All right, that's the Kennedy assassination story. The 9/11 one is pretty interesting, actually. It's a huge part of the country. I mean, I think it's like maybe a third of the population or half the population. The activists in it, the people in the center of it, as far as I can tell, very few of them are people with any record or involvement in political activism, doing anything. Maybe a couple here and there. Most of them are just drawn into it. And, and they have factoids too. Like somebody found nanothermite, whatever the hell that is, on the bottom of Building 7 or whatever. Okay, I have no idea what it means or if it means anything. But that's the core of a large part of the evidence that was done by the Bush administration. Now, the people who are writing about this, they are experts in physics and civil engineering on the basis of an hour on the internet. Okay, so you spend an hour on the internet, you become a super expert in civil engineering and physics, and you learn what nanothermite is, and and so on. And it's kind of like, I mean, I don't have to tell you what it takes to understand something about physics. It's not an hour on the internet. They've managed to collect a very small scattering of architects and one or two people who are supposed to be scientists and a couple of others who write articles in the Journal of 9/11 Studies and maybe sometimes in an online journal somewhere. And so, okay, that proves that the scientific world is with us. And then comes along a big story. There's some obvious questions. Like, suppose the Bush administration did it. Why would they blame Saudis? Are they insane? I mean, they wanted to invade Iraq, right? Everybody agrees with that. So why don't they blame Iraqis? Okay, if they had blamed Iraqis, open and shut case. You get the whole country's for you, you get a UN resolution, and NATO supports you, you just go ahead and invade Iraq. Since they blamed Saudis, therefore harming themselves, that's their closest ally, they had to go jump through hoops to try to invent stories about weapons of mass destruction and connections to Al-Qaeda and all this other thing. They finally invaded Iraq. So, like, are they lunatics? I mean, that's one possibility, of course. You got another explanation for why they should blame Saudis?
The 9/11 person would say yes, because they're very, very subtle.
They're very devious. Yeah, that's exactly what you get. It would have been too obvious if they'd blamed Iraqis, so they had to do it some other way. Yeah, you can you can find answers to anything if you try hard enough. And huge efforts are going into this. Nothing's ever going to happen. They tried it for 7 years. They never indicted Bush. Of course, we're never going to. They go on for another 50 years. It's never going to have any effect. It does have an effect. It diverts a lot of energy and effort from trying to do something like, say, stop the war in Iraq. But of course, that takes effort and it's costly and so on. They also feel extremely brave because it's so risky to write a note on the internet saying, I think Bush is a really bad guy. Wow, you're practically in Guantanamo. And then they can find some guy who, instead of teaching his courses, taught about this stuff and therefore wasn't rehired, which is normal. And I would have never been rehired if I'd done it. I taught courses on this kind of stuff, but in my spare time, you have some duties at the university. But you can put all this stuff together and get some story. So you're feeling very brave and bold, and then come stories about the reasons why people like me don't go along. We're secret CIA agents. We're, I think the phrase is left gatekeepers. There's a category of left gatekeepers. The government inserts into the popular movements people who pretend to be critical, but they're really gatekeepers. They're just trying to stop the real criticism. Bush put the bombs in Building 7 and so on. And you can build up big stories like that, and a lot of people believe them. I mean, it's a little bit like believing that the reason for why my life is collapsing is because the rich liberals who own the corporations are giving everything away to illegal immigrants. You know, it's an answer to, you know, you find some factoids about that. But people who are, you know, kind of at a loss, you know, they don't trust anything rightly. You know, they don't trust institutions. They think everybody's lying to them. Their lies are no good. Nothing makes any sense. Okay, these things have a certain appeal. They, like Rush Limbaugh, they have an internal logic. Maybe they don't make, you know. And if you don't understand what an explanation is, a collection of factoids is an explanation.
There's one part of it that is pretty striking, at least to me, which is if 30 or 40% of the United States population believes that Bush did it, I mean, obviously it's ludicrous, but 30 to 40% of the population believes he did it. Well, that means there's virtually nothing that the left can say to that 30, 40% of the United States that's worse. I mean, how bad can you get, right? Yeah. So then you have to ask, why is that 30, 40% not doing anything, given that they think they live in whatever it is that they think?
Yeah, they think they're run by a mass murderer who wants to kill the American people. Yeah. Okay, let's go on to the next topic.
But it is interesting because it says, what do you have to do to talk to that sector of people, not about 9/11, but about changing the world that they live in?
I ask a lot of people that. Yeah. So, you know, you think you're being run by a maniac who wants to kill all the Americans, why don't you do anything about it? The answer is always the same. It's hopeless.
Yeah, that's
there's nothing we can do. I mean, we're just victims of some powerful force.
But it is an important answer. Because it says something to us about what our agenda has to be. We have to overcome that.
You have to say, look, there are things you can do about the real problems. First of all, figure out what the real problems are. Then you can do something about them. But of course, that's, you know, that for the person you're talking to, that's a much harder choice.
Sure.
It's easier to say, I can't do anything, I give up. It's easier to say that than to say, look, there are a lot of things I can do, and then go ahead and do them, and they really are risky, and so on. Yeah. It's that way with a lot of things. I mean, take, say, the...
It's very graphic.
This one's very graphic. There are a lot of others, not quite this graphic, right. But, I mean, take, say, the Israeli lobby story. It's extremely convenient to believe that the Israeli lobby controls the United States.
It's out of control.
First of all, what can I do? You know, the Jews are so powerful, I can't do anything. The other thing is, it preserves American innocence. So we are the city on the hill. It's just that we're being led around by these Jews. What can we do? And in many ways, it's a very attractive position. I mean, it falls apart as soon as you look at it, obviously. But it doesn't make any difference. And it does attract a lot of people on the left. A lot of people.
No. Yeah, is there such a thing as human nature? Or are the groups or the people who deny the possibility of such a thing, which includes a great many Marxists, correct in denying that there's any such thing as human nature?
Well, either there is such a thing as human nature, or humans are angels from another planet or another universe. I mean, any organism that exists in the organic world has a nature. That's what distinguishes it from other organisms. So we're different from insects, we're different from apes, you know, and so on and so forth. And that can either be because we're like other organisms and we have some kind of a nature, or it's because maybe God implanted us in the world or something like that. Those are the two options. Now, you're absolutely right about Marx. People call themselves Marxists. In fact, even well-known Marxists like Gramsci say that there's no nature, human nature, there's just history. If you can find a couple of phrases like that in Marx. They can't have meant what they said. What they probably meant was, you know, human nature can take have many different exemplifications depending on circumstances, which is of course true. The same is true of insects. But this has become a kind of a slogan. And it's considered sort of it's considered that if you, on the left, or what's called the left, that if you deny that there's any human nature, you're in favor of change. If you say there is a human nature, you got to be reactionary, because you're saying, you know, people have to be rotten and have slaves and so on. There's nothing like that. In fact, if you take a look at Marx, who they pay fealty to, he was a dedicated believer in human nature. I mean, in fact, he took most of his ideas right out of the Enlightenment and the Romantic period where he lived. And he carried them over. That's his concept of alienation, for example, and You know, somehow your fundamental nature is a need for creative work under your own control. If it's dominated by others, you get alienated labor. You know, the whole story comes out of that. It's based on a conception of human nature. Is there any evidence for it? Well, let's take the real study. I mean, let's assume we're not angels. Okay, we're organisms. So therefore, there is human nature. Okay, then we try to discover what it is. Well, we do it the way we discover what bee nature is. It's much harder. You know, we're much more complicated organisms. And unlike other organisms, we can't do direct experiments. But if you want to study the parts of human nature that have to do with the issues that matter in human affairs, you can't do anything much in the way of comparative evidence because humans are just different. There isn't much in the way of comparative evidence. Some, but it's pretty thin. And what there is, you know, at an evolutionary distance of 12, 15 million years. It's a long time. Other animals have changed and we've changed. So you just don't get much. I mean, there's some comparative evidence, but not much. Direct experimental evidence, yes, there's some in some areas. Like, take, say, language, where I work. Yeah, there's quite a lot of evidence there, and that it's a unique human property. There's nothing remotely like it in the animal world, as far as we know. But you can learn a lot about it, because it's kind of isolated, and you could separate it from other things. Actually, many of the questions you'd like to ask about language are beyond experiment, the traditional questions. Like, for example, how you and I are doing what we're now doing. How are we able to produce freely new expressions that have maybe new ideas that have never been expressed, and if you say it, I understand it, and so on and so forth. What's sometimes called the creative aspect of language use, which was a big topic, and you know, in the tradition. I mean, Descartes, Rousseau, Humboldt, others, but we don't know. We can't study that. We can study the mechanisms that enter into it, but not much about the. As soon as you get to choice and decision and so on, you're kind of at sea. But there are a lot of topics you can study. There are many that are beyond what we know how to study, but there's got to be a nature. Otherwise, we're kind of like either we're angels or kind of like amoebas. You know, anything that happens to us just shapes us, and we become some shapeless form.
Otherwise, a baby could grow up to be a penguin.
Yeah, something. Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, there's a huge debate about whether there's an innate language faculty. Well, you know, I mean, the answer to that is so trivial that you could have to wonder who's asking the question. I mean, like, if, say, my granddaughter and her pet, a chimp or, you know, songbird or whatever, have exactly the same data, how come my granddaughter picks out of the data something that's language related, reflexively, of course, and then again reflexively ends up doing what you and I are doing, whereas the other animals don't even take the first step? Well, it's either a miracle or she's got a language faculty. There's no other option. But there's a huge debate about that, even among people called scientists. People are extremely rational about themselves for some reason. But yes, there has to be a human nature. If there wasn't, you know, it's just stuff. It's inconceivable, and we can try to find out what it is. Well, you know, on issues that really matter to us, the sciences don't tell us very much. Let me tell you a little. So, for example, why are people, say, altruistic? Why do you help others? Okay, there's some evidence from biology. Most of it just sort of gives some basis for what you know anyway. So people tend to be more caring for their children than for their cousins, let's say. Okay, you can give a story about kin selection, you know, the genes that get proliferated and so on. It tells you something. I mean, it doesn't tell you why people on Cape Cod go into icy waters and storms to try to rescue stranded dolphins. You know, no kin relation, you know, but they do it, you know. And it doesn't tell you why they spend huge effort in doing that, but don't care about a kid starving across the street, you know. They don't tell you why you take care of your stepchildren, you know, where you know they're stepchildren. I mean, so yeah, it tells you something. And there are some, there's one category, reciprocal altruism, worked on by Robert Trivers, a very good biologist, which actually has some interesting results. You know, you help somebody else, they help you, you know, so on. Most things you just have to rely on what we call intuition, meaning introspection, experience, evidence of history, whatever they may be. And you can get some not vacuous speculations about what human beings are like.
What's the utility of the view that there is no human nature that causes it to be widespread, particularly on the left?
The utility is that you can convince yourself, if you're sufficiently irrational, that that means we can introduce changes. Incidentally, these views are extremely popular among a segment of the left, the Leninist segment. They may deny it. But these views are useful for people who want to be managers. If there's no human nature, then if I control people, there's no moral barrier to it. Because if there's no human nature anyway, I can determine what they should be, and of course I'm completely benevolent because there's no human nature for other people, there is for me. So I'm benevolent, and I know what's right, and therefore I can kind of help these amoebas to turn into good things instead of bad things. It's a very convenient doctrine for the managerial class, which includes a lot of the left, unfortunately.
There are people who will respond to the idea of justice, equity, fairness, people controlling their own lives, and they'll say, oh yeah, it sounds nice, but human nature precludes it. Human nature is such that, and I'm talking about, caring people who will just say, yeah, of course I'd like to live in a better world like that, but it's like asking a tree to fly. It's not possible because there is a human nature, and human nature is such that it precludes the possibility of that kind of situation and yields instead what we see all around us and what we've seen through history. How would you try to talk to counter, to address that kind of view, which is very widespread?
Well, two ways. First, the way you try to evaluate any factual statement. All right, you made a factual claim. Back it up. Do you have scientific basis for it? Do you have evidence for it? Well,
they're going to say, my evidence is all over. No, I have a history of, well, that's what they're going to say. I have a history of suffering and conflict and
you have a history
denial,
of benevolence and dedication to improving things. Yeah, history tells you all kinds of things. Doesn't tell you what you want. Same history can tell you the opposite if you want. So you're picking out of history certain features which happen to have an interesting consequence. They prevent you from doing anything. They're very self-serving. I mean, if nothing can be changed, then it's fine if you just want to be Ayn Rand or something. But you have no evidence for it. Because if you take a look at history, you can just as well find the opposite. You can show in history that Kropotkin was right in saying that mutual aid is a factor in evolution. Yeah, okay, it's as good as the evidence to the contrary. So you take the range of history and experience and so on, and you can pick out something that will justify you in just looking out for number one, or you can take something that would justify you in devoting yourself to the welfare of others. It's your choice, but you can't claim any argument from history. In fact, if you really take arguments from history seriously, we could argue about how seriously you should do it, but there is something noticeable. I mean, there is a tendency throughout history towards more and more commitment to justice, equity, and freedom. And you see it pretty clearly. And we even see it in our own lifetimes. Like take, say, women's rights, rights of minorities, concern over future generations, the environmentalist movement. That was very limited 40 or 50 years ago. Now it's quite broad. You go back further, say, the right to vote, right to associate, right of freedom of speech, by and large, rights, there has been there's regression, a lot of horrible things, but one pretty noticeable tendency in history is towards more freedom and justice and equity.
But the interesting thing, actually one of the interesting things is that when people engage in antisocial behavior, they have to, and routinely do, act as though that's not what they're doing. They cover it with a rationalization. Well, why would you need to do that? If antisocial behavior was actually wired in and part of us, we wouldn't alibi it. We would just say that's what we're doing. I mean, a wolf wouldn't say, I'm eating the sheep because I'm trying to help the sheep. It would just say, I'm eating the sheep because I'm hungry.
That's right.
And the same thing goes for humans. No, nobody does that.
Henry Kissinger probably would say it on the Cambodia bombing. But, you know, yeah, that's a good argument. Why do you bother to rationalize?